Hey internet friends! History is littered with tales of individuals devising new ways to kill each other. Throughout the centuries, the deliberate use of bacteria, viruses, and toxins has been proven as an effective means of neutralizing a targeted population, a practice that has been dubbed biological warfare. Fast forward to recent times and poisoning the well with plague-ridden corpses just doesn't quite cut it anymore. Especially not for empires whose culture is rooted in endless war. After all, the war machine requires the latest and greatest. But while the bioterrorism budget is booming, the pool of volunteers willing to test out the effectiveness of these weapons is anything but. That's why today we're going to blast back to the past and examine the lessons of history, focusing on a handful of unethical human experiments that we know about, as well as the global government, organizations, and individuals who carried out these barbaric experiments by means of deception. Powerful entities still around today who demand the blind trust of the general populace, though the only established track record that they hold is one of total disregard for human life. Today we're going to talk about a selection of horrific human experiments carried out under the American flag. Number 1. The Filipino prison experiments. Found within the first book of Samuel in the Bible is the oldest account of what is speculated to be the bubonic plague. The story goes a little something like this. When the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant from the Israelites, the Philistines were afflicted by an epidemic of what was later thought to be the plague, the symptoms affecting each town to which the Ark of the Covenant was taken. The link was established by mentions of what was later roughly translated to mean rats and buboes or tumors, and further established by the knowledge that humans can be infected by fleas who have fed on infected rodents. The Philistines returned the Ark of the Covenant in repentance, and offered 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice to end the plague. But that wouldn't be the last time that a disease, thought to be naturally occurring, would be weaponized. In the late 19th century, the United States military, along with universities, began medical experiments on prisoners in the Philippines, which was, at the time, an American territory. These experiments included injecting prisoners with the bubonic plague, beginning with 5 select prisoners for the first round. Later, Yale and Johns Hopkins University graduate Professor Richard Strong infected 24 prisoners with what he reportedly thought to be cholera, but turned out to be somehow contaminated with bubonic plague, killing 13 of those prisoners. Whoopsie-daisy. Well, to his credit, Dr. Strong argued that he was thoroughly convinced that man could withstand the same amount of plague organism as a guinea pig. Dr. Strong was later found innocent of any criminal negligence, and he later had a thriving career as a professor of topical medicine at Harvard. But his experiments on prisoners didn't end with accidental plague inoculations. A few years later, he conducted another round of experiments, this time dealing with beriberi, a deficiency disease resulting in paralysis and ultimately heart failure. Although several prisoners died as a result, the remaining few were rewarded with cigars and cigarettes. What a reward for narrowly escaping death, right? So worth it. To make matters worse, it's not like these prisoners volunteered for these experiments or even had the slightest clue as to what was going on, which begins our theme of non-existent voluntary or informed consent, at least for this video. Number 2. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Conducted by the Public Health Service in partnership with the Rockefeller-funded Tuskegee Institute in 1932, the clinical study of untreated syphilis targeted 600 African-American men, Alabama sharecroppers who believed they were receiving free health care from the United States government. Of the 600, 399 of those men had reportedly already contracted syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease, before the study began, and the remaining men were purposely infected with the bacterium, told they were being treated for bad blood. The projected 6-month clinical study spanned over the course of 40 years, and for many of those men, clinicians followed them until their eventual deaths. Though penicillin became the treatment of choice for syphilis in 1945, measuring the effectiveness of treatments wasn't the goal of this study. No, the goal of this 40-year study was to observe the consequences of untreated syphilis. And, spoiler alert, while syphilis often presents with a painless red sore at the infection site, when untreated, syphilis can cause damage to the internal organs, like the brain or the heart, and progresses through stages serious enough to result in death. It wasn't until much later that the horrors of the Tuskegee study surfaced. And a legal settlement included a lifetime of, wait for it, medical benefits to the study subjects, their wives, and children. Number 3. The Devil's Experiments in Guatemala. Dubbed the Devil's Experiment by Guatemalans, a series of venereal disease experiments took place in Guatemala between 1946 and 1948, and was led by physician James Charles Cutler, who was also involved in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. The Guatemalan experiments involved infecting an estimated 1,308 unsuspecting victims with an STD. But this time, instead of just targeting African American men, the pool of victims opened up to children as young as 10, mental patients, prisoners, prostitutes, and soldiers. There were 80 documented deaths as a result. These experiments were reportedly conducted so researchers could look for ways to prevent STDs from spreading, with their focus on stopping the spread of diseases amongst soldiers at war. Guatemala was chosen so doctors could avoid the pesky ethical constraints of informed consent. Studies show that a number of patients were infected with syphilis and brought to the brink of death, only to test the effectiveness of penicillin as treatment. Once treated, patients were infected with yet another STD, and the process started over again. Dr. Cutler acknowledged his ethical violations in 1947, stating, "Unless the law winks occasionally, you have no progress in medicine." Since the United States owned up to these experiments in 2010, there have been several lawsuits against the United States government, the Rockefeller-funded Johns Hopkins University, and the Rockefeller Foundation to the tune of $1 billion in damages. But the real damage has yet to come to fruition, given that there's no telling how many infected Guatemalan children and grandchildren of these victims are running around right now. The reverberations and consequences of these experiments resulting in generational effects, given that mothers can pass syphilis to an unborn child, and when left untreated, there's a high risk of stillbirth or infant death. Beyond the threat of lawsuits, those who conducted these experiments got nothing more than a slap on the wrist, if that. The Rockefeller Foundation is still just as influential as before, steering the medical community as it deems fit, because deep pockets have sway and can even rewrite history. If knowledge of unethical human experimentation was commonplace and everyone knew that the major pharmaceutical companies of today were the heads of the United States biological warfare program of days past, like George Merck of Merck & Co., now a major vaccine maker, if individuals held this knowledge, would they still accept inoculations without asking their doctor or researching what they're putting in their bodies first? When I see recent headlines about how syphilis cases are at an all-time high, it makes me wonder how organic of an occurrence that is, and how much of the problem has been created to strike fear and outrage in the masses, so that a manufactured solution like a vaccine can be introduced to create profit, a solution with its own host of problems, a solution concocted by those with a sordid history, unworthy of your blind trust, as their only proven track record is one of disregard for human life. Number 4. The Ohio Penitentiary Cancer Experiments. A man who eventually became the vice president of the American Cancer Society began his reign of terror in an Ohio State penitentiary in 1952. Chester Southam, a Sloan Kettering researcher, an institution which was unsurprisingly also funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. I know I sound like a broken record at this point. Anyway, Southam sought to discover how healthy bodies fought the invasion of malignant cells. So he injected live cancer cells into prisoners as well as 300 healthy women at Sloan Kettering, all of whom were not informed of Southam's extracurricular research. However, at the time, doctors were fully aware that injection of live cancer cells might cause cancer, even in healthy individuals. Nearly a decade later, Southam set his sights on 22 elderly patients at a chronic disease hospital in Brooklyn, injecting them with live cancer cells, all without their consent. Why? Well, he wanted to test his hypothesis, of course. His hypothesis was that bodies racked with serious but non-cancerous diseases would reject live cancer cells as rapidly and completely as healthy bodies. This time, a few whistleblower colleagues came forward, refusing to participate in Southam's experiments, and ultimately resigning. His unethical practices eventually made headlines and even saw the inside of a courtroom. And his punishment? Brace yourselves for this one, it's a real doozy. The New York Medical Licensing Board put him on probation for a year. Number 5. Operation Sea Spray. During the World Wars, the funding of the United States biological weapons programs increased, and it continued well into the Cold War. In 1950, a secret experiment was conducted by the US Navy in an effort to test the vulnerability of susceptible regions of the United States in the event of a biological attack. The Navy sprayed clouds of Serratia bacterium from a giant hose for 2 miles along the San Francisco Bay coastline, successfully dosing nearly 800,000 residents during the week of spraying, all unbeknownst to the general populace. Though the Navy claimed the bacteria was harmless, the reality is it can cause urinary tract and wound infections in some, as well as gastrointestinal and respiratory issues in others. The week following Operation Sea Spray, 11 adults checked in the hospital with serious UTIs linked to the bacteria, and even 1 man died as a result. Furthermore, an increase in pneumonia in the Bay Area was later speculated to have been linked to Operation Sea Spray. So are you wondering about the results of the experiment? San Francisco Bay was identified as highly susceptible to biological attacks due to its iconic fog. Pentagon reports that were declassified decades later revealed that the military had performed open-air testing of biowarfare agents an estimated 239 times across American cities like New York City, Panama City, and Key West from 1950 to 1966. Other reports detailed the release of deadly nerve agents over Alaska and dousing Hawaii with bacteria. And these experiments were not limited to the United States, but extended all the way to Canada and even Great Britain. After these reports were declassified, the Defense Department admitted that the tests weren't exactly harmless. And due to the exposure to deadly chemicals and bacteria, soldiers and civilians alike have suffered serious health ramifications. It was in 1969 that President Richard Nixon issued an executive order to end all U.S. offensive biological weapons programs. And supposedly all US stockpiles were destroyed by 1972. However, as y'all will see in my upcoming videos, experimentation on human guinea pigs certainly didn't end in 1969, nor was it limited to germ warfare. Now, if you're someone who has watched this video all the way through and is hammering away on your keyboard right now to make the argument that, despite how unethical and brutal these experiments in this video were, the results provided pharmaceutical companies, physicians, and the military with information they needed. Before you comment that, I'd like to ask you something. Are you willing to volunteer yourself, your mother, your father, or your children as test subjects for the next round of experiments? Get back to me on that one. Thank you all so much for watching. You know I always enjoy reading your comments. Thank you for subscribing and supporting my channel on Patreon. I'll see you in my next video. Bye!